into our country. We're getting rid of a lot of bad ones from jails, from mental institutions, drug dealers.
The governor of Kansas and the governor of New Mexico both say that they will direct police to physically block, to physically turn back any Japanese Americans who appear at their border.
When I speak to our residents, it's not just about frustration, it's also about fear.
Now, with the Trump administration in court telling judges things that the judges palpably can't believe and that aren't true and that are disproven.
We stand at a hinge moment. A moment where one leader says he is saving America, while historians warn that we have walked this road before. Fear is rising, power is expanding, and the language of protection has begun to sound dangerously familiar. Trump frames himself as a shield against outsiders, but America's past shows how easily a shield becomes a weapon. When leaders divide people into good and bad, nations slip into moral darkness. Today's choices decide whether we repeat history or rise above.
We just want people to come over here and safe. We want safety, we want security, we want to make sure we're not letting the wrong people come into our country. We're getting rid of a lot of bad ones from jails, from mental institutions, drug dealers.
The governor of Wyoming says people in my state don't like Orientals and says that in Wyoming, quote, there would be Japs hanging from every pine tree. The governor of Kansas and the governor of New Mexico both say that they will direct police to physically block, to physically turn back any Japanese Americans who appear at their border. The governor of Idaho says, and forgive me here, but he says, the Japs live like rats, breathe like rats, and act like rats. We don't want them.
Trump's words echo the classic pattern of political fear crafting, defining entire groups as wrong people and promising mass removal to appear strong. This method is not new. Maddow's historical clip shows how leaders in the 1940s used the same language of purity, danger, and exclusion to justify brutal acts. Those governors also claimed they were protecting their states. But their protection was built on hatred, not safety. Language like this creates a chain reaction. Fear turns into policy, policy turns into abuse, and abuse becomes normalized. America later apologized for those actions, admitted the injustice, and paid reparations. History proved the dangerous outsiders narrative was a lie. Studies today show the same truth. Immigrants, including undocumented ones, commit fewer crimes than US-born citizens. FBI and Cato Institute data repeatedly confirm this. When Trump paints millions as criminals, he repeats a formula that has already failed our democracy once. Protection built on fear weakens the nation instead of securing it. Moral clarity is not a luxury, it is a national defense.
Because of the disastrous 4 years under President Biden and the amount of individuals that came across that border, many of which were gotaways, many of which, we still don't know who they are. She's likely going to talk about Operation Welcome Allies and the threats from not vetting individuals closely enough. And unfortunately, we saw what happened to those two National Guardsmen in the District of Columbia recently. I think she'll also talk about nation-state threats. She'll talk about China. She'll talk about Iran and North Korea, particularly from a cybersecurity perspective. And then, of course, the Western Hemisphere. There's a lot going on here, and obviously with Venezuela, the cartels that have been designated as foreign terrorist organizations by the president. All of this is impacting.
Pearl Harbor, Ralph Carr goes on statewide radio and says that he personally will not judge the loyalty of any man based on where their grandparents were born. He sends a letter to the Japanese American Citizens League newspaper saying, to the American citizen with Japanese parents, we offer you the hand of friendship. While people are asking anyone of Japanese descent to be killed, Ralph Carr is extending the hand of friendship to these individuals.
Chad Wolf lays out a sweeping threat map. Hostile nations, terrorists, criminals, chaos everywhere. It is an alarming picture, but its goal is clear. Build fear first, then justify extreme power. This strategy expands presidential authority by convincing the public that danger is everywhere and only one strong leader can stop it. Ralph Carr represents the opposite philosophy. He defended rights even when fear was at its highest. He faced angry crowds, political loss, and national panic, yet he chose constitutional values over political gain. His stance shows that real leadership does not require exaggerating threats. It requires courage. Modern research repeatedly debunks the idea that immigrants drive national insecurity. Crime rates among immigrants are significantly lower. Border encounters fluctuate due to global conditions, not presidential slogans. But when leaders amplify fear, people become willing to trade liberty for the illusion of control. Fear governance is not strength. It is a shortcut around democracy. The contrast between Wolf's threat-heavy narrative and Carr's rights-focused leadership shows how. Trump's approach mirrors old cycles of power justified by panic, cycles America has regretted before.
2.5 million illegal immigrants have left the U.S. over the past year, including, get this, 1.9 million who self-deported since President Trump took office. Seems like the message is getting through, Chad.
Well, I think so. And the administration's been very clear about this with Tom Homan and Secretary Noem and others out there, making sure that the message is getting out there, which is if you come into the country illegally, you will be removed. That is a very different mantra than obviously under the 4 years of President Biden and even under previous administrations. The idea was if you got here, however you got here, then odds are that you were going to stay in the United States for a good period of time. And of course, that was the goal. Well, now the odds are that you will actually be removed. You'll be detained.
When I speak to our residents, it's not just about frustration, it's also about fear. They've never been afraid of their government before, and now they are. And there has not been a community meeting that I have gone to where
Trump presents the numbers as a victory, millions removed, millions pressured to leave, a system tough enough to make people flee. But numbers do not tell the whole truth. Mayor Higgins' testimony reveals the human cost behind those statistics. Families losing relatives without warning, workers disappearing from homes, parents taken while children watch. That is not security, that is instability. Economists show that mass removals hurt local economies. Cities rely on immigrant labor in construction, agriculture, caregiving, and hospitality. When people vanish, businesses slow down, prices rise, and communities weaken. Studies from states like Arizona and Georgia confirm that aggressive deportation waves caused billions in economic losses. Fear governance also creates a silent population. People too scared to call police, report crimes, or cooperate with authorities. That makes communities less safe, not more. History teaches that when governments use fear to control people, trust dies and instability spreads. This moment is a hinge moment because America must choose values over panic. Power can grow cleanly through law and dignity, or it can grow through fear, secrecy, and scapegoating. Trump's approach echoes the darkest chapters of the past, but the future does not have to repeat them. The next step decides everything. The battle is no longer only on the streets or in speeches. It has moved into courtrooms, into legal briefs, into quiet hearings where truth must stand against political power. Democracies do not collapse loudly. They fracture when leaders bend the law, twist evidence, and weaponize fear to gain unchecked authority. When governments lie to judges, justice becomes a tool for the powerful. And once that line breaks, the Constitution becomes a suggestion, not a shield.
We need to make sure that we understand who they are. And so looking at that social media, if they're here and they don't believe in the United States and we believe they're going to take action against the United States based off of some of what they are saying and doing on social media, well, then that's all part of the deliberative process of how you vet individuals. And so this idea that, particularly from countries of concern, particularly from countries that we don't have great diplomatic relations with, trying to understand the vetting process behind that is very, very difficult. So the social media aspect is just another layer there to allow officers at DHS to make some informed decisions.
And in 1942, when Japanese Americans were being thrown out of their homes, rounded up, put on buses, put on trains, and taken to detention centers, and then taken to prison camps, which FDR called concentration camp, one of the things that didn't happen was, mass street protests. Other Americans turning out and saying, stop, we're not going to stand for this. And yes, there was a lot else going on in 1942 when we were just into the war and we were losing the war and there was a huge mobilization happening. But when more than 100,000 Americans were incarcerated this way, essentially in defiance, an open defiance of the Constitution.
Trump's team frames expanded surveillance as a neutral security upgrade, just another layer. But history shows these layers often become chains. Social media monitoring sounds simple, but it gives government the power to judge people's beliefs, thoughts, humor, culture, and private conversations. Once leaders decide that expression equals danger, the boundaries of freedom begin to shrink. The contrast with the 1940s is powerful. Back then, authorities also claimed they needed more information and more control for national safety. That logic led directly to camps, mass detention, and constitutional violations now recognized as shameful. The lesson is clear: small legal steps can open the door to massive abuses when fear guides policy. Modern civil rights groups warn that broad digital vetting risks targeting people for their religion, political views, or ethnicity, the same patterns that drove past discrimination. Democracy requires limits on surveillance, not blind trust in those demanding more power. When leaders justify expanded control by painting entire populations as threats, the nation moves toward authoritarian shadows. Protection without oversight becomes a danger of its own.
Well, I think so. And the administration's been very clear about this with Tom Homan and Secretary Noem and others out there, making sure that the message is getting out there, which is if you come into the country illegally, you will be removed. That is a very different mantra than obviously under the 4 years of President Biden and even under previous administrations. The idea was if you got here, however you got here, then odds are that you were going to stay in the United States for a good period of time. And of course, that was the goal. Well, now the odds are that you will actually be removed. You'll be detained, you'll be being put in detention, and you'll be removed. And I think that message is getting out, whether it's ICE law enforcement officers removing individuals, physically removing folks, or folks saying, look, I don't want to go through that, so I'm going to self-deport, which is what they should be doing. A lot of these folks are here illegally, they've overstayed visas, and they should be self-deporting.
They withheld evidence from the court, which lawyers are not allowed to do, the government is not allowed to do, and the uncovering of that crime, of that government misconduct, is an incredibly thrilling story that it takes all sorts of interesting characters to unwind over decades. But, you know, the courts essentially greenlit this because they took the government's word for it when the government didn't deserve to be trusted on this. And we see a lot of parallels to that right now with the Trump administration in court telling judges things that the judges palpably can't believe and that aren't true and that are disproven. The presumption of regularity, we keep hearing about that. When the government lies to the court, it clears the way for the courts to essentially greenlight things that are things that the country will regret. And I think one of the most corrosive things the Trump administration is doing, particularly around the way it's treating immigrants, is lying to the courts about what they're doing. And that puts both the courts and the government and the victims of these policies in absolutely untenable positions.
Trump's removal policy depends on the courts accepting whatever the administration claims. That is why the warning in the second clip is so important. When governments hide evidence or mislead judges, they remove the only barrier between executive power and vulnerable communities. This is how constitutional violations become legally approved actions in the 1940s. The government defended mass incarceration with false claims of military necessity. Judges trusted those claims, and the result was one of the greatest civil rights failures in American history. Maddow's warning shows that similar patterns are emerging again. Legal briefs built on exaggerations, selective evidence, and fear-driven narratives. Documents from recent years reveal hundreds of lawsuits challenging Trump-era immigration actions, from family separations to prolonged detentions to blocked asylum access. Many cases show that officials provided inaccurate or misleading information. When judges cannot rely on honest evidence, they cannot protect the Constitution. Detention plus deception is a dangerous combination. It creates a system where people can be taken, held, and deported before courts even understand what is actually happening. A democracy cannot survive on fear and falsehood. It survives on truth, transparency, and accountable power.
Disastrous 4 years under President Biden, and the amount of individuals that came across that border, many of which were gotaways, many of which, we still don't know who they are. She's likely going to talk about Operation Welcome Allies and the threats from not vetting individuals closely enough. And unfortunately, we saw what happened to those 2 National Guardsmen in the District of Columbia recently. I think she'll also talk about nation-state threats. She'll talk about China. She'll talk about Iran and North Korea, particularly from a cybersecurity perspective. And then, of course, the Western Hemisphere. There's a lot going on here, and obviously with Venezuela, the cartels that have been designated as foreign terrorist organizations by the president. All of this is impacting the homeland in a real way. And then we can't forget about Antifa. We can't forget about the domestic terrorism.
When you talk about people as rats and rabbits, and you talk about them being unassimilable and responsible for all the crime and all these other things that we're hearing from the Trump administration now openly, all they are trying to do is pave the way for authoritarian powers for themselves, for emergency powers toward an inhuman set of scapegoats that's supposed to justify anything they want to do. It's augmenting their own powers at the expense of a scapegoat, and it's the authoritarian playbook back to the very beginning of time. When they're doing it openly, we need to change our analysis to recognize what they're using it for, and not just point out that they're saying it.
Wolf's long list of threats is designed to overwhelm. When fear feels endless, people become willing to accept extreme measures. That is exactly how authoritarianism grows, not with one crisis, but with a constant flood of manufactured danger. The opposing clip reveals the deeper strategy: dehumanize a group, blame them for every problem, then justify extraordinary powers to control them. History shows this clearly. Leaders who describe people as animals or criminals open the path to unchecked authority. It starts with language and ends with laws that silence, detain, or expel. Trump's framing of immigrants mirrors this blueprint. Studies show immigrants have lower crime rates than US-born citizens. Yet the narrative of crime-filled outsiders persists because it is politically useful. When fear becomes a tool, the Constitution becomes an obstacle. Emergency powers grow, surveillance expands, and communities live in fear of their own government. But democracies thrive on the opposite values: openness, fairness, pluralism, and lawful limits on power. America's strength has always come from resisting scapegoating, not embracing it. This moment demands clarity. Fear is not a policy. Division is not leadership. Human dignity is not optional. The nation must choose truth over panic and rights over raw power. America stands at a turning point once again. The lesson is simple: fear cannot guide the future, and power cannot stand above the Constitution. The nation must choose courage, unity, and values that protect everyone, not just those in favor. Fortune favors the bold. Unity beats fear. We choose democracy.
The wrong people come.